So this is the Kuali System Administration training where we're going to focus on editing templates in the form designer. So this is primarily for the compliance modules. There may be something similar to this in sponsored programs eventually, but at the moment, this is going to be focused on compliance. This tool, the template editor, is used both in conflict of interest and in the protocols module. And I am going to be spending some time in both of those modules. Most of the functionality is the same, but there are a couple things that are unique to each module. And where there's a substantial amount of configuration there, I do want to spend some time talking about that. But the first half of this session is really going to be just a general orientation on the template editor, how it works, and how you can expect that functionality to impact the behavior of the modules. So let's come over here, and I'm going to go ahead and jump over to the conflict of interest system. So in the configuration section, down here we have templates. And this is where you're going to go to find your form designer templates in conflict of interest. You'll see in the second half when we move into protocols that there's a similar dynamic in protocols, but it's a little more expansive. There's a little more nuance there. But when we come in here to conflict of interest, we can go and we can see the archived templates. We can go back and see a history. It doesn't go back all the way. There is a limit on how many historical templates will display. If you needed to get to older configurations, they are in the system. You could get to them via API, but we did put a cap on what shows up in the UI, and that's mostly just about performance. But you can go back and look at previous templates if you want to. But for our purposes, I'm going to go ahead and click on the top template, which is active. So I want to make a change to my template. I want to change something about the conflict of interest disclosure. So I can come over here and click new version. And when I do that, now I'm in a pending template. If I come back to the template screen now, I still have that active version, but there is now a pending version in the system. So the thing to be aware of is there can only ever be one pending version. If I come into active again, I don't have an option to create another template. These have to move in sequential order. So you can't kind of have multiple paths that you're prototyping at the same time. But I'm going to come into my pending template, and I'm just going to talk through kind of the overall organization of the template editor. So you'll notice we have these containers here, these boxes that have other gadgets within them, other form elements, and they're called pages. So the top level of all of our templates are pages. So I can collapse the pages to really focus in on what I'm looking for. And if I go all the way to the bottom, I can click on add item, but at that top level, I can only add a page. I can't add anything else. And in disclosure, each page is going to create a paging effect for a researcher or reporter who's completing their disclosure. It's a screen, and then you have a next and back button. There's a similar dynamic in protocols. In protocols, it's important to be aware that paging only really works for the main protocol document. You can't page an amendment form or checklist. So we don't support it in all areas, but in the main documents, we do have paging support. So within each of our pages, we can come in and then add different types of gadgets, different form elements. So if I open this element up here, we can see this is read-only text. This isn't actually a field. A lot of times at the very top of a form, you might have a heading, some introductory information explaining the form in the abstract to your users. And for that, you would want to use read-only text. The other purpose for read-only text is a lot of times you'll have instructions that will display, say, after you answer a certain form field a certain way. So maybe, as an example, in disclosures, you can actually have the gadgets display based on the type of projects that a user has in their disclosure. So I know for one institution, we had several read-only gadgets that displayed above the financial entities if they had any PHS projects, because they wanted to give extra guidance on the regulations for NIH, PHS. But if all they had were non-PHS projects, so NSF, or other federal non-health related projects, then they had a much more streamlined set of instructions that displayed. And that was done with read-only text and then setting up display rules for that gadget. So I'm going to go ahead and come down and I want to talk through what all the major gadgets are, what you can do with them. So I'm going to add an extra page at the end. We're just going to call this training page. And we're just going to use this to put our training gadgets in, the things that I'm going to demo with, so you can see what's possible. And then I can delete all that very cleanly when I'm done. So you can see each container inside the form designer has an add item button. And if I click this add item button, it's going to allow me to add something to the training page. So we're going to start out and we're going to talk about the text gadgets. So we have text input, which is a single field that you can add. So a single line of text usable for things like phone numbers, IDs, registration numbers. We have text area, which allows us to put in a block of text, an overall, say, paragraph. It will expand to accommodate any amount of text from the user. And then the rich text gadget will allow the person completing the field to do some formatting. They can bold the text that they're entering, underline it. They can do bulleted lists. I don't see rich text used that often, and I don't think I've ever seen it used in conflict of interest, but there are a few cases where institutions want to give that flexibility in a protocol form. And so they might want to add a rich text gadget for, say, their main protocol narrative. But for now, I'm going to go ahead and put in a text input, and we're just going to talk through some of the elements of every gadget that's available. So I'm now going to be adding a simple text field to this template. The first thing that I have to put in is the field label, my field label. So you'll notice over here, we have some instructions that can give us some guidance. The thing to be aware of with the field label is it only allows 32 characters. And that's true on any gadget type. That's true on your text fields, your sections, your pages, anything with a field label, it can only be 32 characters. If I keep typing and I go over, then I'm going to get this counter that shows my maximum number of characters is 32 and I've input 45 characters. So the nice thing about that is it will let me know how much I need to streamline this down. If I'm only over by one character, maybe I can do something like turn an and into an ampersand. But in this case, I really need to streamline my title. And there are several cases, especially with sections, that you might think, oh, I want to use the section header for like a really long dynamic like header at the top. Really, the read-only gadget is the way to go on that. You can do formatting. You can see in the read-only gadget I opened earlier, we had very bolded text there at the top. And the reason for that is in an individual field like this, this is the label that we would expect to be used in a reporting output at the top of a column. If you include this in a list, a recurring set of fields that can be filled out any number of times, then in the table display, this is going to show as the table header. And if you put in a 128 character label, that's not really going to fit reasonably on the table header. And so we do limit that. But I then have the option of hiding that. So I can say, I don't want that to display on the form. I want it stored in the system, again, for reporting or to display on a list if I end up putting this gadget into a recurring field set. But I can put a much longer question here with a formatted follow-up note. And then maybe I want to make the follow-up note purple and just make it stand out. So we have the ability to do more follow-up I can also put in a bulleted list or links here. And then I can put in Google link. And then I can save that. And now this is a link out. If I click on any of the links out, it will open in a new tab. It's never going to take me out of the application. It's never going to open it in the same browser window. So you can see you have a lot of flexibility here. Then there's field help. And field help, I can add some additional text. And if I come up here, I can see it's a slightly lighter text. It appears underneath the field labeled long. And most people would probably think, well, what's the point in that? Why not just make it part of field label long? The substantial difference in functionality here is this is truly guidance text. And when reviewing a document, there might be some guidance text that you just don't want to display on the final printed form or read-only review form. Help text will disappear once the document is submitted. There aren't a lot of use cases for that. I've found a lot of institutions really do want that text to display on the final document so reviewers are aware of all the guidance that was given to the researcher. But if there are instances where you really just want something to be kind of a temporary guidance for the user, maybe you don't want the footers that tell people if you have questions, email here. You want to put that on certain questions. You don't need that to appear in the review version of your form. You could put that in help text and then it won't show up in all of those other outputs, which can be kind of nice. The other option is I can turn off display inline in form, and then it will appear as a mouse over, which again can be very nice. And then you're not going to see this on final outputs. That's not going to print because it's mouse over. It's not part of the main text of the form. So that gives you some dynamism in the behavior you want the text on individual gadgets to follow. Next, we have field width. So if I don't assign anything for field width, or if I choose a designation of large, then every gadget will appear in sequence on top of each other. It'll be one question and then another question below it and then another question below it. If, however, I set this to medium and the next gadget is also medium, then they will appear next to each other to a maximum of 2 in a row. If I set it to small, then up to 3 gadgets in a row will display next to each other. That combined with sections, and you can actually get a lot of formatting power out of the way you lay out the gadgets and make use of some of that white space that appears on the side. If you end up making the screen much smaller, say you're displaying it on a mobile device, it will display the fields one on top of another, even in the case of a small gadget. So there's some adaptive response there that can really help with that display. So to demonstrate that, I'm going to go ahead and put in another text field. And make that medium. And then we're going to come up here and I'm going to view. And you can see these 2 fields are next to each other. And that's how that will display. You can see because this has a very long label and this has a very short label, the actual inputs appear in different areas. I do encourage people to carefully design their gadgets if they're going to have them appear next to each other. It should be multiple fields that have very simple labels. Otherwise, they're going to feel a little bit disjointed. But that's how you can control horizontal display of your fields. So we're going to go back to edit mode. There's one other element of the text field that I want to show. And that is the placeholder text. So I'm going to click here to add text. And if we come up and look at the preview, you can see now we have a gray sort of background text that helps users know where to click. I have found that once I set this up, I tend to get fewer support questions about where do I click? This isn't intuitive. I do really recommend using that mouse over text, that placeholder text whenever possible. All right. So the next thing that I want to show, we've talked about the text fields, is I want to talk about the multi-select fields. So the multi-select fields are, they're kind of all over this screen, radio buttons, drop downs, and checkboxes. And these are all configured the same way. So I'm going to click on radio buttons. We're going to say my radios. And we'll say, what is your favorite primary color? And then I can come down, I have the same field level help, field label long and width, all of that is exactly the same. But now under options, instead of placeholders, I can put selections, blue, red, yellow. So now if I come up and look at my preview, the options that I've put in place are now available as radio button selections. So radio buttons and drop downs are configured the same way and they effectively work the same way. It's just a matter of whether you want radio buttons to display or a drop down. The only major functional difference between the two is once I've selected something with a radio button, let's see if I can keep these collapsed and cut down on the scrolling. So once I've clicked a radio button, I can't unselect that. I can change my selection, but I can't unanswer the question. It doesn't come up very often as a need, but you can unanswer a dropdown. Generally, though, that isn't a major concern. I will use radio buttons when I have a short number of answers, and so it saves you a click of not having to do a dropdown. Or if I have a large number of answers, but they're very long answers, they're extensive and descriptive, and it would be difficult to read them and make sense of them in a drop-down list. I'll use a drop-down list if I have a long list of simple statement answers. So if I have a long list of answers that are only a couple words each, then I'll definitely use a drop-down list. But if it's a short list and it's going to be faster for the user to just read them on the screen, or if I have blocks of text for each answer, I definitely use radio buttons. The third option is checklists, and it did re-extend everything. Oh well. So the third option is checklists, checkboxes, and they're configured the same way that radio buttons and drop downs are. The primary difference is they're going to display directly on a form like a radio button, but you can select multiple answers. So I won't go through and configure that. Again, it's configured exactly the same way, but you can choose multiple answers, and that's the primary difference there. So the next thing I want to show is the filtered drop down. So I'm going to put favorite secondary color. So this is a drop-down list, but unlike the other drop-down list, I don't have general options I can choose. I'm able to pick a drop-down or radio button gadget from somewhere else in the form. So in this case, I'm going to choose my radios. And now I can add options that are associated with each of the first answers. So if I choose blue on the first question, my options are purple or green. If I choose red, it's purple or orange. And if I choose yellow, it's orange or green. And so I can save that. Now, if we come up here and preview, so I have blue and I can see my options are purple or green, but if I change that, my options here will change. And if I hadn't answered this at all, it would be grayed out and I wouldn't be able to answer the follow-up question. There are a few other gadgets that I want to just mention you have available to you, but I won't go through setting them up because there isn't really a lot of configuration associated with them. One is a number gadget. It works exactly like a text gadget, except the user can only put in numbers. They can't put in periods, they can't put in commas. So if you need something in, say, a financial format that needs to include cents, or your users are going to push back if they can't put dollar signs and commas on, large values, you want to use text input. But if you want to control numbers, like say the number of subjects involved in a certain protocol, you want something where you're going to really control that format, then the number input is the better option. Then we have date picker. That will only allow a user to enter a value by clicking on a date selector or selecting it with their keyboard. It is accessible, and then going through and choosing the date, and it enforces the format and is going to capture a very specific date format. Next, we have file attachment. So you can give a place for a user to attach a file. Again, you'll get the same options in terms of field label long, etc. But it's just going to give you a place where you can drop an attachment. There aren't really other configurations on that particular gadget. And then we have static field and static date. In conflict of interest, there isn't really a use for static field or static date in terms of when you're manually building your form. Those gadgets are automatically added when you use some other larger complicated gadgets in the system that I'll talk about in a bit. But I want to mention them here because they are also available in protocols. And in protocols, they really are meant to be manually used by an institution. And there are two main use cases for them. One is on a template where you're going to do data conversion into the system, and you want to do something like, say, collect a history page, a history of actions that were taken on that protocol before you converted it into Kuali during an implementation. You probably don't want your users to go back and change that history data when they do an amendment. And so by using a static field, you can convert data in, but it will just display as read-only text to the user. In order to change the answers to those questions, basically, you have to populate them by API. So they're very useful when doing a data conversion. The other time they're very useful for is if you wanted to set up an integration. So say you want to have a situation where someone has identified that a protocol is commercially funded. And in order for the protocol to be submitted, they have to have shown that the fees for reviewing that protocol have been paid. You might set up an integration using our APIs where they enter in the protocol number, and a person is expected to submit payment documentation through your financial system, list the protocol number, and then you have a nightly batch that will populate that financial number into the protocol system automatically. And you don't want the protocol to be able to be submitted until that's completed. It is possible to make the static date or static field required. It's not the normal course, but it can be done in protocols. So you could set up something like that that drives an iteration. Because it is part of the protocol document, it needs to respect the protocol lifecycle. You're not going to be able to change it when the protocol is in a submitted state or approved. But for those types of integrations where, say, the update is required before the protocol is submitted, you could use it for that purpose. And those are really the primary uses that we put those static fields in for the protocol system. All right, the next thing I want to talk about is progressive disclosure. So we're going to go ahead and add another text area. And I'm just going to label this progressive disclosure. And we're going to say our question is, why is blue your favorite primary color? And we just want an explanation if you select blue. So this is a situation where you only want this question to display if there is an appropriate answer on a previous question. So I'm going to click here now on progressive disclosure rules, and I'm going to type my radios, and it's going to jump right down to that field. You can scroll through this field. I have to acknowledge there's kind of a very visible bug here. That, I do want to acknowledge it's not terribly impactful, but you will notice if I go to the top, the first section is the title of the section and the only field in that particular section or page. And then when I go down to the next section, the first section is listed, and the third section, both of the previous sections are listed. That does recur right now. It doesn't get in the way, it doesn't stop anything from working. And in disclosures, it's not too terribly distracting. On large protocol forms, it makes it a little difficult to navigate the fields at the bottom of the list. So I pretty much always do the jump to through typing. If you have multiple gadgets that are named similarly, you might have to type and then pause and type a couple times, but it's definitely the fastest way to navigate progressive disclosure and get to the values that you need in the list. So we're going to choose my radios, and then we have a number of options. These options will change based on the gadget you're basing your progressive disclosure on. So in this case, I'm basing it off radios. So radios or drop-downs can only have one answer. So the options are going to be the answer is, the answer is not. If I were doing this based on a checklist, then I would have different options. It's not, is it the answer? It's, does it have that? So it's, say, a checklist of the types of participants involved in a protocol. It will be, does it have children? Does it have, you know, prisoners, etc. But it's still going to execute as true, even if there are several answers. You can also, when basing progressive disclosure on a checkbox, just check for a number of answers. Does it have more than 3 answers? Does it have less than 2 answers? So we tried to build in all the options that are appropriate for each gadget type. With numbers, you can do more than or less than. You can also certainly do, is equal to. And then you can actually check text. Text is always going to be, does it contain? You can basically set up kind of a keyword. Does this term appear anywhere in the text field? There aren't that many uses for that text case, but I have used it a couple times. So those are just, when you want to base progressive display off a gadget, you can click on it and see what your options are. If you don't see the option you need, you might want to consider structuring your question differently. So it's built into a gadget that is going to give you the progressive disclosure rules that you need. So in this case, we're going to do my radios is blue, and then blue is the best. We'll put that as our placeholder text. So I can save that. And then if we come back up here, then it's red or yellow. I don't have that question, but as soon as I answer it blue, then why is blue your favorite primary color appears, and I can put in my explanation. But if I change this back to red or yellow, then that question is going to disappear. So next, I want to talk a little bit about lists. So if I come down here, I can also create a list. My recurring data set. So lists are recurring sets of fields. So I have a field that I want the user to answer multiple times, and maybe I don't know how many times they need to answer it. In conflict of interest, the primary use case for a list is the financial entities. That's already set up in the system when you get it. But I have seen a couple other uses. I've worked with one institution that collects reports from users on an annual basis as part of their conflict of commitment process. And in protocols, lists are pretty much everywhere. So I'm going to go through here and again, same options with size and field label, but I can come down here and my unique configuration options are inline and dialog. So we're going to start and just leave that as inline. And I now have a list, but there are no fields in it. So I can come here and I can drag some of these other fields into the list, or I can create brand new fields inside the list. So I can click here and add a new field if I want. Now that I have fields in my list, if I open this up again, I now have the option to display what my default columns are. Now, for inline, I would never want to unselect any default columns, and I'll show you why. If we come up here and we preview, now instead of those fields being out here, I can click Add Info, and my 3 fields are going to display. So now I can answer this, and the dropdown is going to react to what the answer is in this first line. So I have blue, I can choose purple or green. If I add another line and I choose red, my dropdown here is going to react to that answer. You'll notice progressive disclosure is always displaying. And so with a table, we didn't really want fields to appear and disappear. All the feedback we got is that would not be a good user experience. There's another option that I'm going to show where you can have progressive disclosure work in a list, more in the way that you think of it working. But there is a reason for progressive disclosure, even in an inline table list like this. While the template preview doesn't have required fields because I can't submit this preview, there is validation in both conflict of interest and in protocols. And you can have a field that's contingently required. So if I were to have this in an actual disclosure, I would have to answer this question because I've selected blue and the rules that I have set up on progressive disclosure. But the answer to this entry would be optional because I selected red over here. I do want to pause there. That's a little bit nuanced. Does anyone have any questions about that relationship? Okay. All right. Well, then let's go back up and I will show you how dialogue lists work. So we've done inline. I also have the option now to do dialogue. And for dialogue, I'm going to go ahead and drag these 2 text fields in as well. And let's add a quick date field. What date did it happen? And now we've got 6 fields. And maybe if you have a really big high resolution monitor, those could all display decently in a table for you. But for most people, that's not really going to work as a table. So if I come up here, now I can choose to have this set up as a dialogue. And I only want some key information to display in the table and then allow the user to drill in and see all the other information. So I'm going to turn off all of this and we're just going to show the color information as kind of the key indicator of what's going on with each entry. So I can save all that. And now if I preview, now I only see these 2 entries, but I can do this and it's going to pop up and let me enter in additional information. The other nice thing about dialogue is if you have recurring fields and you need a long explanation, you need a full robust question and not just a table header, we can display the full table information. Also, we have full traditional progressive disclosure in terms of which questions display and which ones are you able to answer. Again, the cell in the table, if you display that column, is going to be there. We don't do anything to kind of indicate that the cell is missing, but it won't be required. And when you actually get in here, you won't be able to answer questions the same way you couldn't answer a question that's not being progressively displayed in the main part of the form. So in in disclosures, financial entities are almost always going to be dialogue lists, and other areas where you would probably use dialogue lists would be, say, procedures in an IACUC form. They're usually very long, very robust lists. They're kind of complete forms unto themselves that are being added into the system. So those are places where you'd really want to use a dialogue list, and you can get fairly nuanced when you get in there in terms of how you break things down into sections. The one thing I do want to caution with dialogue lists, and this is really an issue in protocols, not in COI, there is a level of embedding that will eventually sort of disrupt the validation system. So you can embed, say you have a section that has a set of progressive disclosure rules on it, and then you have other questions inside the section that has different progressive disclosure rules on it. And then you can actually do multiple levels of that to get to very fine-grained progressive disclosure. When it's in a list and you do that, and it's kind of tracking the multiple entries in a list, that can actually eventually reach a point where you're not properly firing validations. And we've improved that, but the level of complexity and performance involved in supporting kind of multiple layers of progressive disclosure and validation inside a list has been a little bit prohibitive. So I do suggest taking a make it only as complicated as it needs to be approach when building your lists. If you absolutely need the complexity to get to the right functionality, you can build that. But just be aware you may have some trade-offs around how much requiredness you can have around fields. All right. So there's the next thing I want to show is I want to show progressive disclosure based off of a list. Um, and for this, I'm going to talk about something a little bit unique to conflict of interest. So I'm going to come here and we're going to do my recurring data set. And I'm going to come down to the progressive disclosure. And we're going to build progressive display based off of another list. So if I come down here, I want to actually click on projects. And projects is a card list. So it's a different type of list in the system, but it has basically the same options for progressive disclosure. And in conflict of interest, card lists are used for your projects that are pushed, your proposals, your awards, etc., that are pushed into the system. And this is how we can build awareness of the type of projects that you have in the system. So if I come here and I choose projects, instead of it just asking is not, I'm going to have these options that are asking me about the list itself. So is it not empty? Is it empty? Or all rows have, no rows have, or some rows have, some array of data in them. So I'm going to do some rows have, and we're going to look at sponsor name and code. So sponsor name and code, I can do includes or does not include, which accepts a fixed sponsor number, or I can base it on sponsor type. It is federal, it is not federal, or I can have separate kind of sponsor types that I've created in a sponsor hierarchy. So I'm going to say projects, some rows have, and I'm going to say has sponsor hierarchy. Now, I now need to know what are the sponsor hierarchies that I have in the system. Thankfully, for COI, I can actually get to that without having to go into my sponsored programs monolith. So I'm going to open up another instance of COI in another tab, and we're going to come down to sponsor groups. The COI system displays all of this information for us, and that is going to help with just being able to navigate what's here without training your COI staff on sponsor hierarchy, without giving them access to all of that. So I want to use COI disclosures. So if we come back here, sponsor hierarchy has sponsor in hierarchy, COI disclosures. And I'm going to save that rule. So I now have this rule, and I want to come up here and I want to preview it. So I come over to view. The problem is I don't have any projects in here. There are no projects because this isn't a real person. But if I come up here, I have type a name to view template as that user. I can type in Damon Ralston, and this is going to pull in the actual data from his most recent disclosure, which maybe Damon does not have a disclosure. So let's try Inez. All right, Sorry about that. I thought I knew who had disclosures in the system. Maybe they hadn't been fully approved yet. All right, let's look at Dr. Borst. Give me just a second. I'm gonna try refresh. There we go. So now I can come down and I can see the information as it's in her actual disclosure. The big advantage of that being I have these projects that are loading, and these projects have sponsors that fulfill those rules. So now I can confirm that this is displaying properly based on that project list having information in it. This option to view a template as a specific user only exists in conflict of interest because we don't pull in the same kind of personal information that can't be loaded in protocols. But in disclosures, it's critical to be able to fully proof changes to the template before you publish. Is there any questions about any of that? And those general list logic dynamics, does this field have this particular progressive disclosure option? Those can be used on any list. I just wanted to demo it with projects so I could also demo this preview function. All right. So I'm going to show one more thing related to conflict of interest, and then we're going to go ahead and jump over to protocols. So if I come down to my training page, we can now come down and take a look at projects. So if I come here and I add project declarations or projects questionnaire, that's going to add a large complicated gadget to the form. So I'm going to add my declarations example. So now this is basically added all of the out-of-the-box default configuration for projects. Project declarations is where you're going to put in your dispositions when you disposition a project, or the researcher is going to declare on the relatedness between their financial entity and their projects. And so this is going to display everything in the system. But it just shows kind of the baseline configuration. I can also now come and I can add additional fields. So we have project type, project number, project role, sponsor name and code, but there are other values that are available. So we can put in a project link that will link back to an integrated project. We can put in the prime sponsor, notice of opportunity, and there are a number of other fields we can add. When I add one of these, it's going to come in with the field key, which is the variable that's defined in the system already configured, and I can't change it. So you can't accidentally link to the wrong thing. So I can go ahead and add that. Let's try that again. I think this is, yeah, this is a little bit confused because there's already a declarations gadget on this template. I'm not going to be saving this configuration. So sorry about that little bit of confusion. Let's actually go up and look at what a full declarations configuration looks like. Let me go ahead and refresh to clear out all that stuff I just added. So here under declarations, we can see we've added prime sponsor, notice of opportunity, and you can have progressive disclosure within a card list. So something like notice of opportunity, maybe you don't want that to display for certain project types. You don't need that to display on award since you don't have a notice of opportunity listed there. So you could set that up to only display for proposals. Or sponsor project ID, technically that does integrate with proposal, but you know you're almost only ever going to have an award, a sponsor award ID. So you don't have that display for proposals. This can get much more involved if you have manual project types you've created. You don't want the project linking to display for your manual project types because they can't be linked together. There are lots of different reasons that you would do that sort of progressive disclosure. And so you can build all that within a project. It is important to note that progressive disclosure in a list, whether it's one of these project card lists or a regular list, can only be based on other data in the list. I can't say I only want linked projects to display if a user answered the first question on the form yes. I can't build that logic. It's just kind of an architectural limitation right now. It is something that we want to work on expanding eventually, but at the moment, you can't build that sort of logic into the system. So there are a lot of different things you can do here, and there are a lot of different sort of subtle conflict of interest features, things like linking financial entities out to the sponsor list that then you have to configure differently in declarations. So there's several things you can dig in very deeply here, but that kind of gets into much more COI specific functionality. So before I jump over to protocols to show a couple of the unique things in protocols, are there any questions about anything that I've shown so far? Okay, that sounds good. Then I'm going to jump over to protocols, and we're going to look at the template screen here. So you'll notice that I now have a template type value, whereas in disclosure, we only had the one template. We just had COI disclosure. In protocols, we have several related templates and 3 different protocol types. So we have IRB, IACUC, and IBC. If you're working in a Canadian domain, we've probably done localization to change the titles of those: humans, animals, biosafety, something along those lines. But it's still going to be the same 3 sets of templates. And then within that, we have the main protocol template, which is I'm doing a new protocol. This is the main body of my research. And we have the amendment. I'm amending my protocol. And so what are the extra questions I have to answer on an amendment action? Renewal, I'm putting in a continuing review or a renewal of my protocol. What are the special questions that I need to answer when doing a renewal? An event, I'm submitting a reportable event. What are the special questions I need to answer on this form? It's a separate form that's linked to a protocol. The admin only form, which is a set of like 4 compliance office only fields that are linked to a protocol. This one is still in pre-release. Right now, the admin only form works properly for a newly implementing school. There's a little bit more work we need to do. I've talked with Hamza and we're hoping to get it in fairly soon, but there's a little bit more work we need to do so that a school that has existing protocols, everything will upgrade properly to the admin only form. And we're still kind of iterating on a few things before this is fully ready for release, but you should see this sometime this year broadly rolled out. So this creates fields that can be filled out only by the admin office. So to record regulatory details or other things that they want to kind of have on file that are about the office's determinations. And then participating sites. If you have a single IRB situation and you have other sites, they can have their own forms associated with them. The final one is not part of the protocol, and that's the organization. So we've added basically an organization's maintenance table to protocols where you can list organizations that are used for external reliance, single IRB, just general cooperative research agreements that relate to your compliance domains. And you can define what fields display in organizations. And so that's what that template is for. We're going to have the same active pending archived version, but because there's so much more going on here, we do have a full set of filters. There aren't a ton of attributes. It's not like filtering on a protocol, but we can look at the type, system, IRB, IACUC, or IBC, the template type. Those are the organization renewal protocol, those types I just went through. The version, we can search on version numbers, and then we can look for the created date and who created it. And then we can also choose columns. But again, in my experience for this screen, you generally want to have all of the columns up. You can save filters here, and I do actually recommend, because there's so much more going on this screen, to save a filter where status does not contain ARC, and that'll filter out all your archived versions. You can always go back and search for them. They're available. Unlike disclosures, you can search any of the archived versions. Because we can filter, we're able to handle a higher volume of data. And there are cases where you might want to go back and revert to a previous archived version. And so in order to do that, you can go back to that version, export that template, and then load it in as your next version. And I'll talk about export and import of templates in a little bit. But for now, I'm going to come in here and click on IRB protocol. And I'm going to talk about a couple of the configurations that are a little bit more distinct to protocols. So we're going to go to the bottom, and I'm going to do the same training section. So we have kind of a scratch space that I can delete easily after this is done. And I want to go through and just talk about a couple things. So we have funding sources. There's not really a lot of configuration to do on funding sources, but it's going to provide integration with the sponsored programs office. So if I click on funding sources, this is the gadget that lets you look up an award or an IP or a proposal development document that is funding a given protocol. So if we come down, there's validation on whether or not it's required. So in the COI office, in the COI module, if a field displays, it's required. The only way to make a field optional is that inline list dynamic I showed you, where you can set up progressive display in an inline list. We do use that for reporter comments on their declarations, or if they say no conflict or not related, we don't ask for further explanation. But if they indicate there is something to report, they do have to describe it. But aside from that inline list dynamic, everything is required. In protocols, you can control what's required and what's optional, and you do that with this validation option right here. Any gadget you want to be required, you click validate, and it adds that required value to it. So go ahead and hit cancel. We do have a delete catch in protocols. There was some concern from customers. There's a lot more variation, a lot more changing in protocols. So we are going to give you a warning around that. The next thing I want to show, because this gets used in protocols quite a bit, it is available in COI, but I wanted to demo it in protocols because that's generally where it's useful, is the list value dropdown. So we'll say personnel. Just a moment, I have to sneeze. Sorry about that. So list value dropdown is going to let you come down, and instead of listing a series of values, I can choose from the lists that are in my system. So say I want to check based on university personnel and person. So I'm going to hit save, and then we're going to jump over to view. And right now, I can't fill anything out on this field. But if I go back to the top and we add a couple people to the people list, minus 2. In a real protocol, I'd have to fill out quite a bit more of this information, but I am going to take some shortcuts since we're in the template editor. So now I have a couple people listed. And if I come down to the bottom, I can now choose those individuals from this drop-down list. I've really seen 2 use cases for this. One is if you have questions about who is going to perform a given procedure, who is going to collect consent, and you want to have a hard requirement that anyone that does that is listed on the protocol, then you can do this. And that avoids people listing individuals that they don't actually have in the personnel section. It just, having those controls on the form minimizes the amount of bad data that gets submitted to your office. The other use case is an IACUC with species. On most IACUC forms, you'll list your species at the top, and then you have sections on housing and procedures and maybe drugs or other things that are being used in the protocol. And you're going to list which species is this procedure going to be performed on, which species is being housed at this location and in what numbers. And one pain point we heard from a number of schools is, again, they'd get forms where people listed species down form that weren't on the species list, and there's important data on the species list. And so they'd have to send it back, or in a worst case scenario, it would be missed in the review process occasionally, and then that was a real headache, and could be caught by auditors. So by using this list value dropdown and referencing your species list, that becomes impossible. If they want to list turtles down in the procedures, they're not going to be able to do that until they have added turtles in the species section. Again, this is available in the COI module. We went ahead and put it there. I think I've used it once, and it was kind of a very institution-specific use case, but I use it in protocols all the time. The next thing, we just have a few minutes left, and I want to preview something. This is kind of a taste of something that's to come. This isn't released yet, and it's not actually fully working yet, but I can show you how it will be configured. So if I come down here, oh, give me just a moment. I thought I had this turned on, but perhaps not. Okay. Let me give this a refresh. So we have this new gadget down here under logic called assign ancillary reviewer. Again, this isn't working yet. We have the ability to configure it, so I can show you what this is going to look like. This will be coming out a little bit later this year. This is going to allow you to set up logic in the form to define when an ancillary review could be assigned. So I can come here and say biosafety. And then I can come down and I can add progressive disclosure. Does look like a couple things might still be missing from here. So say I could go to the general questionnaire and is research, and we're going to check for biological specimens is yes. Eventually what you'll be able to do is then indicate, all right, which ancillary reviews that are configured in this system should automatically be assigned when this protocol is submitted. So that's going to set up something that a lot of institutions have wanted. We've gotten a lot of really great feedback on ancillary review, but largely institutions would like the assignment to happen automatically. So there's just less manual work involved. And so that's something that's coming. We're going to really be doing that inside the template itself, so that you can drive that logic based off data in the form. And we'll automatically inherit any of the progressive disclosure rules we have and any new progressive disclosure functionality that we roll out in the future. So I know that was kind of a marathon of template editing. Are there any questions or anything that anyone is curious about or would like me to go into more details on?
Victor, I know there's not much time. We probably could do this after, but what are the limits on funding source? I think we ran into some limits, maybe because we're hybrid on-prem. I don't know if that's the limit.
Yeah, so right now with funding sources, it's set up to work with an all hosted environment. Is this NOAA?
Yes, this is NOAA.
Yeah, I'm exploring options for connecting your on-premise funding source to your cloud protocols. So once that's in place, you'll be able to leverage that functionality. There are some limits on that around the progressive display you can do based off the funding sources gadget. We do want to expand that in the future, but you can list any document that you want in that integration gadget, as long as the person searching for it has permissions to the document, because it is using our APIs, and the APIs do respect the user's permissions from their session.
Okay, thanks.
Hey, Victor, this is Zach from CSU. I have a quick question about committees and personnel. If you have 15 John Smiths, is there a convenient way to determine which one is the correct John Smith?
I think we could talk about that separately. We've generally approached that by displaying the username or email of the person when you search for them. That has not been applied in committees yet. That's still pending work. The best way to do that is to look them up by their email.
Okay, thanks.
Does anyone else have any questions about anything I've shown? Okay, well, I hope this was useful. I know going through templates in an hour is a big data dump, but I don't want to hold anyone. Make sure you can get to your next session and in time. Thank you all for coming.